What's up everyone, Alex here. Gestalt, Cinder is a solid Metroidvania title, but it's a little bit held back by its storytelling. You see, Metroidvania as a genre is diverse and expansive, and the reason why I say this is because there are games that have completely different focuses, from combat, platforming, and its most important quality, exploration. However, storytelling has always been a weakness in the genre. Now, keep in mind that I'm not saying that every Metroidvania doesn't have a good story. There are in fact Metroidvanias with good stories, but this is extremely difficult to pull off well because of the balance between the amount of gameplay that you have and the amount of story. This is why most Metroidvanias use the story as an excuse for gameplay, or simply hide most of the story in its lore, like Hollow Knight. Gestalt, Cinder is a fun game that tries its best to tell a compelling narrative, but stumbles in its execution. The footage you're seeing right now is from the PC version of the game, and I'd like to thank Metamorphosis Games for providing me with this game code. Now, before I get into the story, let's talk about how gorgeous this game is, because its sprite work is just beautifully animated, with characters moving fluidly. In fact, there were some animations that I would just rewatch just to appreciate their expressive and smooth movements. Its environments are distinct and detailed, each of them conveying a sense of place and location within its world. Backgrounds broaden the scope of the world by creating the sense that you're just exploring one piece of a larger whole. And through its visuals alone, this world just feels interesting. Its music is also really good, which sets the mood appropriately, and its steampunk setting manages to have a nice sense of atmosphere due to how the visuals and music go hand in hand. Its colorful, vibrant, and intricate characters and environments are coupled with an industrial yet playful soundtrack. There's an effective use of juxtaposition at play here, and by that I mean that the harshness of the steampunk setting is offset by how colorful the game truly is, and the soundtrack even sounds mechanical thanks to its industrial soundtrack, but jaunty at the same time. All of these seemingly opposing elements come together to create a familiar yet distinct world. In terms of its aesthetics, this game is an absolute triumph. I just wish more of the story in the world was left to my imagination. Now, it's not a stretch to say that most people who play Metroidvanias are expecting a gameplay-focused experience. As stated earlier, this isn't to say that a good story can't happen in this genre. However, it requires great care and consideration for the player experience. Unfortunately, this consideration and pacing is inconsistent in Gestalt, Cinder. Especially early on my playthrough, I felt annoyed by how many times I felt interrupted by its story. I kept thinking to myself, I just want to play this game. But the game insisted on just telling its story, which made me feel annoyed and almost resentful. It's in this sense that the story insisted on itself in a way that felt unearned, especially so very early on. This issue is thankfully alleviated as the game goes on, and as the game opened up, it allows players to have more breathing room. I was finally able to play the game in large chunks without interruption, and once this happened, I became much more receptive towards its story. Anyone who watches this channel knows that I love a good story, but I also enjoy actually playing a fun game. Striking this balance is very important, especially in a genre that is so gameplay focused. I think the story would have been easier to appreciate had the ratio between the two had been more balanced, especially in the beginning. All that being said, the story itself unfortunately rarely rises above serviceable. Most of the dialogue felt like info dumps filled with jargon, and on top of that, many cutscenes feel disconnected from the protagonist herself. Even when the characters are literally talking about her, she still felt largely disassociated from the constant political machinations and world building. This made it hard to feel strongly about what was going on, and often during exploration, the game would stop for a cutscene with characters having conversations that took place in a completely different location. Many times, these were characters that the protagonist, Alethea, had never even met. I kept thinking to myself, why should I care about these characters? And to talk about Alethea herself, she's a likable enough character, but that's it. She's headstrong, prefers to work alone, and is generally pretty cool, but there wasn't much depth to her. More time should have been spent fleshing her out, giving her an engaging story arc, or just giving her more vulnerable moments where she expressed herself so that we got to know her better. The story felt more interested in stuff around her, but not her as an individual. Even when the story directed focus back onto her, it was hard to get invested because even those moments had much more to do with the world building than it did her actual character. And to be perfectly clear, the world is interesting, but the game needing to explain the world so much felt completely unnecessary. Characters are important. We need them to be our anchor into these fictional worlds. Our attachment to them becomes the reason why we care. With that in mind, the word that kept coming back to me to describe the story was impersonal. The story seems more interested in fleshing out its cool world, but not so much the characters that live in it. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter how cool the world is when we don't have anyone in it that we actually care about. There's no reason for us to care. But it's not all doom and gloom, because for starters, the combat is genuinely fun, and Alethea has a lot of tools in her arsenal. Going back and forth between her sword and her gun for different combat situations just felt great. Learning new combos for your sword attacks and getting upgrades for your gun kept combat fresh. And even learning how to balance your energy meter for special attacks added thoughtful strategy to how you approach your enemies. You could even play riskier and attack with your sword, or use a special attack to deal higher damage at the cost of your energy meter. I often found myself relying a lot on attacks that didn't use the meter, so that when I felt more pressure during combat, I could fall back and rely on these stronger attacks in a pinch. Exploration and platforming weren't as much of a focus, but were still handled quite well. And the world is not especially huge, but it's big enough to feel satisfying to explore. And there are plenty of secrets and collectibles to find here. Rewards felt slightly uneven at times, with treasure chests either have something really useful like a new accessory, or just some random item that I'll never use. But despite that, exploration was still fun and rewarding, as most of what I found was useful. The platforming, however, starts off pretty simple, but once you unlock double jumping and air dashing, this elevated the game for me. Not only did they open up the world more thanks to these abilities, but this increased the complexity of the level design. Particularly towards the end of the game, I had to get clever about how I used my traversal abilities in order to make progress. But the cherry on top of this all is the skill tree, which reminds me a lot of the sphere grid. And this skill tree will allow you to learn fun new abilities, from increasing your sword combo, adding poison to your bullets, to unique attacks that deal heavy damage. This makes every level up and ability point you find feel important, as you can really feel Alethea getting stronger throughout the game. All in all, for a first effort by Metamorphosis Games, Gestalt, Steam, Cinder is a huge accomplishment. Now, I don't mean that as hollow praise either. Even if this wasn't their first game, I would still confidently say that this is a very good and very solid game. However, I point out its flaws because there is so much more room for improvement. I think this team has a ton of great talent, and it shows in their beautiful artwork, fun gameplay, and clear passion for the world that they created. I think there's a good chance that a sequel could outshine what they've accomplished here, and you can be sure that I'll be keeping an eye out on whatever they release next. But for now, Gestalt, Steam, Cinder is a fantastic game that I recommend for any fan of the Metroidvania genre.